Good evening. My name is Kent Gompert. I am broadcasting live from New Mexico. It snowed earlier today, so never a dull moment. For this week's video assignment, we are looking at the concepts of freedom and liberty, and to do so, we must first define the terms in question. Having done that, we will complete an evaluation on a school of historical thought called consensus and conflict, developed by historians Alan David and Harold Woodman. The whole idea of consensus and conflict in this case is to literally pull apart the definitions of the two terms to see if there are any similarities. Freedom and liberty evolved from the concept of what is called Western civilization. Lawrence Berkman defines Western civ as any cultural entity in which a linear history may be written. Berkman points out that historians over time have always had opposing viewpoints as to what constitutes Western civilization. David Wilkinson and Richardson are two examples. They've long argued over the locations of Western civilization, its origins, the time span, but both reflect the dominant opinion, the consensus, that Western civilization occurred or began during the Greco-Roman period, and that two of the twin concepts that came out of the Greco-Roman era were freedom and liberty. Now, having established the tenet of the role of Western Civ, we'll now have to decide if there's any basis for comparing the two terms. I'm going to use a school of historical interpretation developed by Alan Davis, and Harold Woodman, called the consensus conflict approach. Using that as a basis, we turn to Greg McNamee, who is a contemporary historian and an avid follower of Rousseau, and he uses Rousseau's social contract definition to define freedom as a natural state of man, unfettered by debt or obligation. It's like free will in the sense that man is free to chart his own destiny rather than it being determined by some outside agency such as the church or government. Regarding liberty, McNamee would employ a conflict approach and argue that liberty is different from freedom because it is not a state of free will, but a set of rights determined by tradition and custom, again referring to the church or village or the country that we live in. On the opposing viewpoint, Hannah Pitkin disagrees with McNamee's argument. She points out that early scholars such as Isaiah Berlin and Maurice Cranston argued that originally there was no difference in the definition of the two terms. The problem instead was one of etymology, word definitions. They said that the English language had basically messed up the distinction because when compared to the French, German, and other European languages, there is no difference in definition. Now, despite these different interpretations, believe it or not, there is some agreement between the opposing sides. McNamee would support Pitkin's assertion in the sense that when he was studying the presidential election of 2016, he found that President Trump and other people in his administration failed to define a difference between religious liberty and religious freedom. So that would back up the consensus that was advocated by Pitkin. Both agree that freedom and liberty were a direct result. This is a consensus approach. Both would agree that freedom and liberty were a direct result of Western Civ, and whereas McNamee would suppose that freedom is a condition that all men are born with, he would argue that liberty is different because it's not a state of free will, but the result of a set of rights determined by tradition and custom. Pitkin, on the other hand, argues that liberty and freedom have always been the same thing. It was her contention that over time the problem was with linguistics, because when you compare different languages, many of the European languages fail to make a distinction between the two terms. So in conclusion, the McNamee and Pitkin schools of interpretation reflect the similarities and differences of the terms. Both schools would agree on the origins of freedom of liberty from Western Civ, but have opposing viewpoints on whether they are separate terms or simply misunderstood in the translation of different languages over time. The importance to remember is that freedom was an innate quality born to all men, but not all men and women are capable of enjoying liberty in the societies in which they live today. Thank you.